GhastlyGarlic Episode 44. Terrifying Secrets of Karak Highway. First story, The Silence of Karak Highway. In the heart of Malaysia, surrounded by thick jungles and the shadows of mountain ranges, lies the infamous Karak Highway. A stretch of road known for its winding paths and dense fogs, it connects the bustling city of Kuala Lumpur to the quieter towns of the East Coast. Despite its serene appearance during the day, at night, it transforms into a place of mystery and fear. In 1984, a young couple, Lim and Mai, along with their infant son, were on a journey to visit Mai's aging parents in Kuantan. They chose to travel at night, hoping to avoid the searing heat of the tropical sun and the bustling traffic that often plagued the roads during the day. The couple was cheerful, exchanging light banter as Lim navigated their old, yet reliable car through the darkness of the Karak Highway. The baby, swaddled in a blanket, was fast asleep in Mai's arms, the gentle hum of the engine lulling him into a peaceful slumber. Mai gazed out of the window, watching the shadows of the trees dance under the moonlight. However, as they drove further into the night, the atmosphere began to change. The once familiar sounds of the jungle grew silent, and an unsettling stillness settled over them. Just as they passed through the infamous Karak Tunnel, the car began to sputter. The engine choked and died, leaving them stranded in the middle of the highway. Lim frowned, confused and frustrated. He had made sure the car was in perfect condition before they embarked on their journey. "Stay in the car," Lim instructed, his voice tinged with worry as he stepped out to inspect the engine. Mai watched him through the windshield, her heart beginning to race as the night seemed to grow darker around them. Lim popped the hood and stared at the engine, but nothing seemed amiss. He tried to restart the car multiple times, but each attempt was met with silence. With no other options, Lim decided to search for a phone booth, knowing it could be miles away. "Lock the doors and don't open them for anyone but me," he told Mai, his face pale under the dim interior light. "I'll be back as soon as I can." Mai nodded, fear beginning to creep into her heart as she watched her husband disappear into the darkness. The baby stirred in her arms, sensing the unease that was settling in the air. Mai whispered soothing words to him, but her own fear was becoming harder to mask. Minutes turned into hours, and Lim had not returned. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant cry of an animal. Mai's anxiety grew with each passing second. She constantly glanced at the rearview mirror, hoping to see headlights, but the road remained eerily empty. Suddenly, a strange noise broke the silence, a soft thud on the roof of the car. Mai froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound repeated, rhythmic and deliberate, as if something was tapping on the metal roof. Her mind raced, trying to rationalize the noise, but her heart knew something was terribly wrong. She tightened her grip on the baby, who began to whimper softly. The noise grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was on the roof was growing impatient. Mai's fear was paralyzing, and she couldn't bring herself to move or even breathe too loudly. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something even more terrifying. A shadow flitting across the rear window. It was too large to be an animal and too fast to be human. The shadow seemed to stretch, its form barely visible in the dim light, but its presence was undeniable. Just as Mai was on the brink of panic, a flash of blue and red lights filled the interior of the car. Mai's heart leapt with relief as she saw the familiar shape of a police car approaching. The officers quickly exited their vehicle and made their way toward her, their expressions serious and urgent. One of the officers knocked on her window gently. "Madam, please step out of the car slowly and do not look back," he instructed in a calm but firm voice. Mai hesitated, her fear holding her in place, but the officer's tone left no room for argument. She unlocked the door, clutching her baby tightly, and stepped out into the cold night air. The officers quickly escorted her away from the car, one of them holding a protective arm around her shoulder. As they reached a safe distance, Mai, against the officer's warning, turned back to look at the car. What she saw made her blood run cold. On the roof of the car was the head of her husband, his eyes wide open in a frozen expression of terror. The headless body was nowhere to be found. Mai screamed, her legs giving way beneath her as the horror of the sight overwhelmed her. The officers quickly carried her to their vehicle, shielding her from the gruesome scene. Mai's mind was reeling, her thoughts incoherent, as she tried to process the nightmare she was living. The incident was quickly covered up by the authorities, labeled as an unsolved case, and buried deep in the police archives. The official report mentioned a wild animal attack, but those who were involved knew better. Rumors spread like wildfire about the creature that roamed the Karak Highway, a monstrous being with the body of a bat and the face of death itself. The locals whispered about the old legends of spirits and creatures that inhabited the dark jungles of Malaysia. Some spoke of a vengeful spirit, while others believed it to be the work of a Pontianak, a vampire-like creature from Malay folklore. But no one could say for sure what had claimed Lim's life that night. Mai never recovered from the trauma. She moved away, far from the highway, and never spoke of that night again. But the fear in her eyes told the story, a story that left those who heard it with a lingering sense of dread. The Karak Highway remains a place of mystery and fear, a road where the boundaries between the living and the dead blur, and where those who travel after dark might find themselves in the company of something far more sinister than mere shadows. The legend lives on, growing darker with each retelling, as the highway continues to claim its victims, one by one. End of The Silence of Karak Highway. Second story, The Whispering Shadows of Karak Highway. It was a moonless night when four friends, Ismail, Farid, Johan, and Amir, set out on a late-night drive along the Karak Highway. They were returning from a weekend getaway in Genting Highlands, a trip filled with laughter and camaraderie. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, as the jungle loomed on either side of the winding road. Ismail, the driver, was known among his friends as the most cautious of the group. He had insisted on taking a different route, but Farid, sitting in the passenger seat, had persuaded him otherwise, dismissing the highway's dark reputation as mere superstition. The night was eerily quiet, with only the hum of the car engine and the occasional rustle of leaves breaking the silence. The winding road seemed endless, the dense jungle pressing in on them from all sides. The mood inside the car shifted from light-hearted banter to a heavy, uncomfortable silence as they ventured deeper into the heart of the Karak. The tension in the car was palpable. Amir, sitting in the back, couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The darkness outside the car seemed almost alive, watching them as they drove further into its depths. As they rounded a particularly sharp bend, Ismail suddenly slammed on the brakes, causing the car to skid to a halt. There, in the middle of the road, stood a figure, a woman dressed in white, her long, black hair cascading down her back. She was facing away from them, her silhouette barely visible in the dim light of the car's headlights. "Who would be out here at this hour?" Johan whispered, his voice trembling. The others remained silent, a sense of dread settling over them. Farid, trying to mask his growing fear, urged Ismail to drive around her. "She's probably lost or something. Let's just go." But as Ismail started to steer the car to the side, the woman suddenly turned around. Her face was a ghastly pale, her eyes hollow, and her lips curled into a sinister smile. But what chilled them to the bone was the realization that her feet weren't touching the ground, she was floating. Without thinking, Ismail slammed on the accelerator, swerving around the apparition. The car shot forward, the tires screeching as they sped away. But as they drove, the woman's laughter echoed in their ears, growing louder and more distorted with each passing second. Amir glanced out the rear window, his heart pounding in his chest. His eyes widened in horror as he saw the woman again, now lying flat on the trunk of the car, her face twisted into a terrifying grin as she stared directly at him. "She's on the car," Amir screamed, his voice cracking with terror. The others turned to look, their faces draining of color, as they saw the woman clinging to the vehicle, her long hair whipping in the wind. Ismail pushed the car to its limits, the engine roaring as they raced down the highway. But no matter how fast they went, the woman remained, her laughter growing more maniacal. Farid, who had been the most skeptical, was now gripping his seat, muttering prayers under his breath. Johan, in a state of panic, began reciting verses from the Quran, his voice shaking. The air inside the car grew colder, and the windows started to fog up from the inside, obscuring their view. In a last-ditch effort, Ismail swerved the car violently from side to side, trying to shake the woman off. The car careened dangerously close to the edge of the road, but the woman's grip was unrelenting. Just as they were about to lose hope, the woman suddenly disappeared. The car jerked forward as if released from an invisible hold, and the road ahead was clear. The laughter stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that felt even more unsettling. Breathing heavily, Ismail slowed the car down, his hands trembling on the steering wheel. "Is she gone?" Farid asked, his voice barely above a whisper. None of them dared to look back, afraid of what they might see. They drove in silence, the fear still thick in the air. It wasn't until they saw the lights of a petrol station up ahead that they allowed themselves to breathe a little easier. Ismail pulled into the station, and they all hurried out of the car, their legs shaky and weak. The attendants at the station gave them curious looks as they approached, their faces pale and their eyes wide with fear. "You look like you've seen a ghost," one of the attendants joked, but the friends were too shaken to respond. As they gathered themselves, Johann noticed something odd. The trunk of the car, where the woman had been lying, was covered in long, black strands of hair, tangled and matted as if they had been ripped out violently. They quickly brushed the hair off, not wanting to attract more attention. But the image of the woman, her haunting laughter, and the cold grip of fear stayed with them, a reminder of how close they had come to something beyond their understanding. They never spoke of the incident again, each of them haunted by the memory in their own way. The Karak Highway had left its mark on them, a lingering shadow that followed them long after that night. News of their encounter spread among their friends and family, though many dismissed it as a tale exaggerated by fear. But those who had traveled the Karak Highway at night knew better. They knew the road was not just a stretch of asphalt cutting through the jungle, but a place where the past and present, the living and the dead, intertwined in ways that defied explanation. For Ismail, Farid, Johann, and Amir, the highway would always be a place of nightmares. A place where they had come face to face with something from the darkest corners of Malaysian folklore. A place where the shadows whispered secrets of the long-forgotten dead. And so, they avoided the Karak Highway at night, each of them carrying a piece of that terror with them. They never spoke of it, but the silence between them was a constant reminder of that fateful night when they had encountered the whispering shadows of Karak. The mystery of what they had seen and what truly haunted that stretch of road remained unsolved, leaving them with a deep, unsettling question: what else lurked in the darkness of Karak, waiting for the next unsuspecting traveler? End of The Whispering Shadows of Karak Highway. Third story, The Haunting of the Yellow Volkswagen. The Karak Highway, with its dark corners and thick surrounding jungle, has long been a place where myths and reality blur. Among the many tales that haunt this stretch of road, the story of the Yellow Volkswagen stands out as one of the most unsettling. It's a tale whispered among travelers, passed down through generations. A story of an old car that seemingly defies the laws of nature. The legend began in 1956, when a man met a gruesome end at the hands of his unfaithful wife. Consumed by jealousy and rage, she brutally murdered him and claimed his beloved yellow Volkswagen as her own. However, it is said that the man's spirit could not rest, driven by a burning desire to reclaim what was taken from him. Over the years, stories began to surface of a phantom car, a yellow Volkswagen, that would appear out of nowhere on the highway, causing chaos and fear. No one knew if the spirit of the wronged husband was truly behind the wheel, or if it was something darker, a malevolent jinn, a supernatural entity known for tormenting the living. But one thing was certain: those who encountered the yellow Volkswagen were never the same again. In 2009, Amirul, a young university student from Gombak, found himself traveling down the Karak Highway on his motorcycle. He was returning to his hometown of Temelo after a long week of exams and late-night study sessions. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting an eerie glow across the sky as dusk settled in. Amirul had heard the stories of the haunted highway, the ghostly apparitions, and the mysterious car, but he dismissed them as mere folklore. He was a man of science, and such superstitions didn't fit into his worldview. But as he sped down the highway, the growing darkness around him seemed to cling to the road, thickening like a living entity. The hum of his motorcycle was the only sound breaking the silence of the night. He kept his eyes on the road, his mind focused on getting home. However, a feeling of unease began to gnaw at him, as if something was watching him from the shadows. Just as he rounded a bend, his heart skipped a beat. There, in the distance, was an old yellow Volkswagen, its faded paint glowing under the dim light of the street lamps. The car was moving slowly, almost too slowly, and there was something unnatural about the way it seemed to glide along the road. Amirul's first instinct was to overtake the car, but a strange thought rooted him to the spot. He had heard the stories, after all. The yellow Volkswagen that appeared suddenly on the Karak Highway. A car that no matter how many times you overtook it, would always reappear in front of you, leading drivers into a never-ending cycle of terror. He gripped the handlebars of his motorcycle tighter, his palms beginning to sweat. The car's brake lights flickered, almost taunting him to pass it. Amaral knew he shouldn't, but his rational mind was at odds with the primal fear growing in his chest. Just as he made up his mind to stay behind the car, it slowed down even more, almost to a crawl. Amaral couldn't maintain his speed without overtaking it, so, against his better judgment, he twisted the throttle and veered to the right to pass. As he drew alongside the yellow Volkswagen, he glanced into the driver's seat. To his horror, there was no one there. The car was empty, yet it moved as if controlled by some unseen force. Amaral's breath caught in his throat, his heart pounding as he sped past the car. He pushed his motorcycle to its limits, the engine roaring as he tried to put as much distance between himself and the phantom vehicle as possible. But just as he thought he had left it behind, he saw it again in his mirrors. The yellow Volkswagen, now closer than before, its headlights glaring like the eyes of a predator locked onto its prey. Amaral's fear turned to panic as the car closed in on him, its presence overwhelming. He tried everything to escape it, speeding up, slowing down, weaving in and out of lanes. But the car was relentless, always reappearing just ahead of him. He could feel the malevolent energy emanating from the vehicle, a cold, oppressive force that seemed to seep into his very soul. The road ahead stretched endlessly, the darkness pressing in from all sides, as if the world itself had been swallowed by the night. Then, without warning, the car disappeared. Amaral blinked in disbelief, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The road was empty. The only sound was the wind rushing past his ears and the steady hum of his motorcycle. For a brief moment, he felt relief wash over him, but it was short-lived. Just as he rounded another bend, the yellow Volkswagen appeared once more, directly in front of him. This time, its headlights flickered on and off, the taillights blinking erratically, as if the car was in distress. But Amaral knew better. This was no ordinary car. It was a harbinger of doom, a cursed entity that would not stop until it had claimed its next victim. Desperate, Amaral recited prayers under his breath, his voice shaking with fear. The air around him grew colder, and he felt as though unseen hands were closing around his throat, making it harder to breathe. In a final act of defiance, Amaral slammed on the brakes, bringing his motorcycle to a screeching halt. The yellow Volkswagen sped forward, disappearing into the darkness ahead. For a moment, everything was still, the silence deafening. But then, from the shadows, the car reappeared, this time racing towards him with impossible speed. Amaral barely had time to react as the car passed through him, its ghostly form sending a wave of icy cold through his body. He gasped, his vision blurring as the world around him began to spin. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the yellow Volkswagen, its taillights glowing like the fires of hell as it vanished into the night. When Amaral awoke, he was lying by the side of the road, his motorcycle overturned a few feet away. His body ached, and his mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. He had no memory of how he had ended up there, but the lingering chill in the air told him that what he had experienced was real. He staggered to his feet, his hands trembling as he righted his motorcycle. The road was empty, the night eerily quiet once more. As he rode away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that the yellow Volkswagen was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. Amaral never spoke of that night, but the terror he felt stayed with him, a constant reminder of the supernatural forces that haunted the Karak Highway. The legend of the yellow Volkswagen continued to spread, its presence a dark stain on the already cursed road. Travelers on the Karak Highway remain wary, especially at night, for they know that somewhere out there, the yellow Volkswagen still roams, driven by a force beyond understanding, a relentless spirit bound by a curse that will never die. End of The Haunting of the Yellow Volkswagen. The end.
Thanks for tuning in to our podcast. If you enjoyed our exploration of ghosts, mythical creatures, and urban legends, please share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling episodes. Until next time, my beloved listeners.